If you look at a map of the world from the summer of 1914, you will see the British Empire painted in a proud and dominant pink. It covers a full quarter of the globe. It is the largest empire in human history, vast enough that the sun literally never sets upon its territory. It dominates the world's oceans and controls the trade routes of every continent. From the outside, looking in, it appears to be an invincible monolith of power, wealth, and stability. But appearances were deceiving. If you were to walk into the private, smoke-filled office of the First Lord of the Admiralty in Whitehall, London, during that fateful summer, you would not have found men basking in the glory of imperial rule. You would have found a group of men who were quietly terrified. They were not afraid of the Kaiser's army marching through Belgium or the vast legions of the Russians. They were afraid of something much simpler and much more fundamental. They were afraid of running out of fuel. For 100 years, the industrial and military power of the British Empire had been built on a single black rock, coal. Britain was an island made of coal. The damp valleys of Wales produced the finest steam coal in the world. It was cheap, it was abundant, and most importantly, it was British. The Royal Navy, the iron shield that protected the empire, ran entirely on this coal. Every strategic coaling station, from the Rock of Gibraltar to the port of Singapore, was stocked with black mountains of Welsh anthracite. As long as the ships of the world ran on coal, Britain was the undisputed master of the planet, because Britain controlled the source of the fuel. But the world was changing. Technology was advancing at a terrifying pace. In 1912, Winston Churchill, the young, radical, and fiercely ambitious head of the Navy, made a decision that would change the course of history. He decided to switch the fuel of the Royal Navy battleships from coal to oil. It was a brilliant military decision. From an engineering standpoint, it was a no-brainer. Oil burned significantly hotter than coal, which gave the massive steel ships more speed and acceleration. It burned cleaner, which meant the fleet didn't give away its position on the horizon with massive clouds of thick, black smoke. And most importantly, it was liquid. It could be pumped through pipes and valves. This meant that the stokers, the men who shoveled coal deep in the belly of the ship, didn't have to exhaust themselves to the point of collapse during battle. It meant that ships could be refueled at sea, extending their range indefinitely. An oil-fired fleet was faster, deadlier, and vastly more efficient than the old coal burners. To prove his point, Churchill ordered the construction of a new class of super dreadnoughts, the Queen Elizabeth class. These were to be the fastest and most powerful battleships ever built, and they would run exclusively on oil. But politically and strategically, it was a nightmare. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. Britain had no oil. There was no oil in the Welsh valleys. There was no oil in the Scottish Highlands or the English shires. By switching to oil, Churchill had made the Royal Navy dependent on a foreign substance that had to be imported from thousands of miles away. He had traded the absolute security of domestic coal for the tactical speed of foreign oil. This single decision created a panic in the halls of the British government that would lead directly to the invasion of the Middle East. It turned the desolate, malaria-ridden swamps of Ottoman Mesopotamia into the most valuable real estate on Earth. This is the story of how the desperate need for a black, sticky liquid drove the British Empire to invade a country that didn't even exist yet. It is the story of a corporate raid disguised as a military campaign. It is the story of how the British government secretly bought a company called Anglo-Persian Oil and then used the British army to secure its assets. It is the story of the invention of Iraq, not as a nation-state for a people, but as a container for petroleum. To understand why British soldiers would eventually die in the blistering heat of the Iraqi desert, we have to look back a decade earlier to a man named William Knox D'Arcy. D'Arcy was not a soldier or a politician. He was a gold miner who had made a fortune in Australia and returned to London to live the life of a wealthy gentleman in Grosvenor Square. But D'Arcy was bored with high society. He was a gambler at heart, and he was looking for the next big score. In 1900, he heard rumors from French geologists about oil seepages in the desolate deserts of Persia, the country we now call Iran. At the time, the Middle East was not known for oil. The oil of the world came from the fields of Pennsylvania in America and Baku in Russia. The idea of drilling in the barren, bandit-infested rocks of Persia seemed practically insane to the investors of London. But D'Arcy took the gamble. He used his diplomatic connections to approach the Shah of Persia. In 1901, he signed a historic concession. It gave him the exclusive right to search for oil in a territory larger than France for 60 years. In exchange, the Shah got $20,000 in cash and a promise of 16% of any future profits. For 7 long years, D'Arcy bled money into the sand. He hired a self-taught engineer named George Reynolds to lead the expedition. Reynolds and his men dragged heavy drilling equipment by mule and camel through the unforgiving terrain of the Zagros Mountains. They faced typhoid, smallpox, and cholera. They were harassed by local tribesmen who demanded bribes to let them pass. The heat was unbearable, often reaching 120 degrees in the shade. Their drills broke against the hard rock. Their supplies were stolen. Back in London, Darcy had spent his entire Australian fortune. He mortgaged his house, he borrowed from friends. He was on the brink of total bankruptcy. The British Admiralty was watching with interest, but they refused to offer financial help. In 1908, the directors of the syndicate in London finally lost their nerve. They sent a telegram to Reynolds in Persia. It was a surrender. The telegram told Reynolds to stop drilling, pack up the equipment, dismiss the staff, and come home. The money was gone, and the dream was over. But George Reynolds was a stubborn man. He had spent years in the desert, and he believed he was close. When he received the telegram, he ignored it. He told his men they would drill for one more week. It was an act of insubordination that saved the British Empire. On the morning of May 26, 1908, a low rumble was heard deep underground at a drilling site called Mus'd Solomon, or the Mosque of Solomon. The rumble turned into a roar that shook the ground. Suddenly, a fountain of black crude oil shot 50 feet into the air, drenching the drillers in desert sand and a sticky rain. They had struck one of the largest oil fields in history. This discovery changed the world overnight. Darcy formed a new company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This is the company that would eventually evolve into the giant we know today as BP, or British Petroleum. They immediately began construction on a massive infrastructure project. They built a pipeline snaking from the mountains down to the coast of the Persian Gulf. They built a massive refinery on a swampy island called Abadan, located in the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Suddenly, the Persian Gulf was no longer a sleepy backwater of pearl divers and date farmers. It was the future gas station of the British Empire. But there was a geopolitical problem. The oil was in Persia, but the only way to get it out to the sea was through the Shatt al-Arab River. This river was the border between Persia and the Ottoman Empire. The refinery at Abadan sat precariously right on this border. To the east was Persia, but to the west, just across the water, lay the Ottoman province of Basra. The Ottoman Turks were watching these developments with deep suspicion. They saw the British building pipelines and refineries right on their doorstep. They saw British gunboats patrolling the river, and they knew that the British geologists were already looking across the river with hungry eyes. The Ottomans knew that geology does not respect political borders. If there was a massive ocean of oil on the Persian side of the Zagros Mountains, it stood to reason that the oil field continued underground into Ottoman lands, into the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. In London, the British government was watching too. Winston Churchill realized that he could not rely on a private company to supply the lifeblood of the Navy. Private companies were unreliable. They could go bankrupt. They could sell their oil to the highest bidder, even to Britain's enemies. They could be bought out by foreign rivals like the American giant Standard Oil or the Royal Dutch Shell Group. So Churchill did something unprecedented in British history. In the summer of 1914, just weeks before World War I began, he marched into the House of Commons. He convinced the British Parliament to pass a bill authorizing the government to buy a controlling interest in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The British government bought 51% of the shares. This is a crucial detail that is often missing from the history books. When World War I started, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was not just a British company subject to British law. It was the British government. Its profits were the Treasury's profits. Its security was the state's security. The corporation and the empire had merged into a single entity. So when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo and the dominoes of alliance began to fall across Europe, the British war planners looked at the map. They saw the threat of Germany. They saw the threat to France. But their eyes kept drifting to the Shatt al-Arab. The Ottoman Empire had not yet entered the war. They were watching and waiting, trying to decide which side to join. But the British knew that the Ottomans were drifting toward Germany. The Germans were building a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. If the Ottomans joined the Germans, they could easily cut the British pipeline. They could shell the Abadan refinery from the Basra side of the river. They could choke off the fuel supply of the Royal Navy just as the war began. On October 2nd, 1914, weeks before any war was declared with Turkey, the British government sent a secret order to the government of India. They ordered a brigade of the Indian Army to sail immediately to the Persian Gulf. Their destination was the island of Bahrain. Their mission was to be ready to strike at the Ottoman oil lands the moment the war began. This was not a defensive move to protect the borders of India. This was a preemptive corporate security operation. On November 5th, 1914, Britain formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The very next day, British warships in the Gulf opened fire on the Ottoman fort at Fa, at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab. The invasion of Iraq had begun. The British soldiers who landed in the mud of Fa were mostly Indian troops led by British officers. They were part of the Indian Expeditionary Force D. They were prepared for a minor colonial skirmish. They expected to fight a few ragtag Ottoman soldiers, secure the pipeline, protect the refinery, and sit tight for the duration of the war. And at first, that is exactly what happened. The Ottoman forces in Basra were weak. They were poorly equipped, demoralized, and far from their headquarters in Baghdad. They melted away before the British advance. The British captured Basra, the great port city of the south. On November 22nd, 1914, the British commander, General Barrett, entered the city in a grand procession. He read a proclamation to the local Arab population. He told the people of Basra that the British had come as liberators, not conquerors. He promised them freedom from centuries of Turkish tyranny. It was a speech that would be repeated almost word for word by other generals and other invasions a century later. With Basra secured, the oil refinery at Abadan was safe. The pipeline was secure. The fuel for the navy was flowing. The mission was accomplished. The prudent military strategy would have been to stop, dig in, fortify the position, and defend the oil. But empires are rarely prudent, and oil has a way of making men greedy. In London and in Delhi, the planners began to look at the map again. They saw that they had secured the refinery, but the oil fields themselves were still vulnerable to counterattack. And more importantly, there were rumors of even bigger oil fields further north. German and British geologists had been whispering for years about the immense oil potential of Mosul, a city far to the north near the mountains of Kurdistan. There was a company called the Turkish Petroleum Company, which had been formed right before the war to explore these regions. It was a shadowy consortium involving British interests, German interests, and a mysterious Armenian businessman named Kost Gulbenkian, who was known as Mr. 5% because he always kept a 5% share of every deal for himself. The British government realized that if they stayed in Basra, they only controlled the exit point of the oil. But if they marched north, if they took Baghdad, if they took Mosul, they would control the source. They would control the greatest potential oil reserve on the planet. This is where the mission creep began. The logic of the invasion shifted from defense to conquest. The man chosen to lead this push was General Charles Townshend. Townshend was an ambitious and somewhat arrogant man. He was a banjo-playing eccentric officer who desperately wanted military glory to rival the great generals of the past. He didn't care about oil. He cared about medals, promotion, and fame, but his personal ambition aligned perfectly with the government's greed. Townshend led his army up the Tigris River. The geography of Iraq is defined by its two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Between them lies a flat, featureless plain. In the summer, the heat can reach 120 degrees. The dust is choking. The flies are a torment that drives men mad. As Townshend marched north, the terrain changed. The swamps of Basra gave way to dry, hard desert. The British supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. They were relying on old paddle steamers to bring food, ammunition, and medical supplies up the winding river. The Ottomans were retreating, but they were not defeated. They were trading space for time. They were falling back toward their supply bases, closer to Baghdad. They were drawing the British deeper into the trap. Townshend captured the town of Amara in a daring raid he called the Regatta. Then he captured Kut al-Amara. He was winning victories that looked great in the London newspapers. The politicians were delighted. They saw a cheap victory in the Middle East to offset the horror and stalemate of the trenches in France. They urged him to keep going. But the men on the ground were suffering. The medical situation was appalling. There were not enough doctors. There were not enough boats to evacuate the wounded. Men were dying of heat stroke, malaria, and dysentery. The machinery of the army was breaking down in the abrasive sand, but the lure of Baghdad was too strong. Baghdad was the prize. It was the historic capital of the Caliphate, the city of the Arabian Nights. Capturing it would be a symbolic triumph that would echo across the Muslim world. And beyond Baghdad lay Mosul and the Black Gold. In late 1915, Townshend was ordered to make a final dash for Baghdad. He marched his exhausted army to a place called Ctesiphon, just 20 miles from the city. There, amidst the ancient ruins of a massive Persian arch, he met the main Ottoman army. The Battle of Tehsin was a bloodbath. The Ottomans had dug in deep. They had brought up fresh reserves from the north. They had superior artillery. Townshend threw his men against the Turkish trenches time and time again. The British and Indian troops fought with immense bravery, charging into machine gun fire, but they were slaughtered. Townshend lost a third of his army in a single day. He looked at the shattered remnants of his force and realized he could not take Baghdad. He had to retreat. He fell back to the town of Kut al-Amara, a miserable collection of mud houses sitting in a loop of the Tigris River. He decided to dig in and wait for reinforcements. He thought it would be a short siege. He thought the British Empire would come to save him. He was wrong. The Ottoman army surrounded Kut. They dug trenches around the town, sealing it off completely. The siege of Kut had begun. Inside the town, 13,000 British and Indian soldiers were trapped, along with the local civilian population. They had limited food, they had limited ammunition, and they were about to enter a winter of hell. The British command in Basra tried desperately to break the siege. They sent relief column after relief column charging up the river, but the terrain was a nightmare. The ground was flat and offered no cover. The Ottoman machine gunners mowed down the relief forces by the thousands. 23,000 men died trying to rescue the 13,000 inside cut. Inside the town, starvation set in. The rations were cut again and again. The soldiers began to eat the horses and the mules. Then they ran out of animals. The British officers tried to convince the Indian troops to eat horse meat, but many refused for religious reasons, preferring to starve rather than violate their faith. Disease ran rampant. The stench of the town became unbearable as sewage filled the trenches. Townshend sat in his headquarters sending increasingly desperate telegrams to Basra. In a final act of desperation, he offered the Ottoman commander £1,000,000 in gold if he would just let the army go on parole. The Ottoman commander, Nuruddin Pasha, laughed at the offer. He said the British Empire could not buy its way out of this one. On April 29, 1916, after 147 days of siege, Generaltown surrendered. It was the greatest humiliation in the history of the British Army, greater even than the surrender at Yorktown or the fall of Khartoum. 13,000 men marched out into captivity. They were skeleton thin, their uniforms hanging off their frames. They were ragged and broken. The Ottoman soldiers marched them north across the desert toward prisoner camps in Anatolia. Thousands of them died on the march. They died of thirst, they died of beatings, and they died of sheer exhaustion, leaving a trail of bodies in the sand. Townshend himself was treated like a royal guest. He was taken to an island near Istanbul, where he lived in a luxury villa and drank tea with Turkish officers. But his men were rotting in the desert camps. The disaster at Kut should have ended the British adventure in Iraq. It proved that the invasion was a mistake. It proved that the cost in blood and treasure was far too high. But remember the oil. The British government could not walk away. They had bought the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They needed the fuel for the fleet, and now they needed revenge to restore imperial prestige. London decided that they could not leave Iraq. Instead, they would double down. They sent a new general, a cold and calculating man named Frederick Maude. They sent him with overwhelming force. They sent new heavy guns, new planes, new tanks, and thousands of fresh troops. They built a railway from Basra to supply the front. They turned the invasion from a colonial adventure into a massive industrial operation. General Maude did not rush. He methodically smashed the Ottoman defenses. He recaptured Kut. He avenged the dead. And in March 1917, he marched into Baghdad. Once again, the proclamation was read to the citizens. Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators. But the war was not over. The British controlled Baghdad and Basra, but they still did not control Mosul. The oil fields of the north, the real prize, were still in Ottoman hands. And as the war in Europe dragged toward its end in 1918, the race for Mosul became the most important objective of the entire Middle Eastern campaign. It was a race against time. The British knew the war was ending. They knew a peace treaty would be signed soon, and they knew that, under international law, they could only claim the territory they physically occupied when the final whistle blew. This sets the stage for the final act of the heist, the moment when Britain would brazenly violate a peace treaty to steal a province. This brings us to the end of Part 1. The British Empire has bled for the oil of Mesopotamia. They have suffered the humiliation of Kut and the triumph of Baghdad, but the biggest prize is still out of reach. In Part 2, we will see how the British Army kept marching after the war was officially over. We will see the backroom deals between diplomats that carved up the map. We will see the invention of the state of Iraq and the betrayal of the promises made to the Arabs. And we will see how the black gold of Mosul cursed the region for a century to come. The date was October 30th, 1918. On the deck of the British battleship HMS Agamemnon, anchored off the Greek island of Lemnos, the Ottoman representatives signed the Armistice of Mudros. The Great War in the Middle East was officially over. The guns were supposed to fall silent across the entire front. The lines on the map were supposed to be frozen in place. At that exact moment, the British Army in Iraq was positioned just south of the city of Mosul. They had not captured the city. They were miles away. According to the laws of war and the explicit terms of the armistice, Mosul was still sovereign Ottoman territory. The Turkish flag was still flying over the citadel. The Ottoman garrison under the command of Aliyan Pasha was still in full control. But in London, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and his cabinet were looking at a secret geological report. The report confirmed what they had long suspected, that the region around Mosul, known as the Villet of Mosul, contained vast reservoirs of crude oil. If the British stopped where they were, they would leave this oil in the hands of the Turks, or worse, it might fall into the hands of the French, who had their own colonial designs on the region. So the British government issued an order that defied the armistice. They ordered the British commander on the ground, General William Marshall, to keep marching. It was a brazen act of illegality. The war was over, but the British army advanced on Mosul anyway. They arrived at the city gates a few days after the peace treaty had been signed. The Ottoman commander, Ali Ehsan Pasha, rode out to meet them. He protested furiously. He waved the text of the armistice, which stated that all hostilities should cease. He argued that the British were violating international law and the honor of a signed treaty. General Marshall simply ignored him. He told the Ottoman commander that he had orders to occupy the city. He gave Ali Hassan Pasha an ultimatum: surrender the city or be destroyed. The Ottomans, defeated, demoralized, and knowing that no help was coming from Istanbul, had no choice. They withdrew their forces. The British occupied Mosul. This was the heist completed. The British army had stolen an entire province after the final whistle had blown. They now controlled all three key provinces of Mesopotamia: Basra in the south, with its vital port, Baghdad in the center with its administrative power, and Mosul in the north with its unlimited potential for oil. But stealing the land was only the first step. Now the British had to keep it. And to keep it, they had to navigate a treacherous diplomatic minefield involving their own allies, particularly the French. During the war in 1916, two diplomats named Mark Sykes and France Picot had secretly carved up the Middle East in a backroom deal. In the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, they had drawn lines on a map dividing the carcass of the Ottoman Empire between Britain and France. Crucially, in that original agreement, Mosul had been assigned to the French zone of influence. At the time, Britain didn't care much about Mosul because they didn't fully understand the extent of the oil. But by 1918, with the geological reports in hand, Britain realized they had promised the crown jewel of the Middle East to the French. They needed to get it back. This led to one of the most cynical horse trades in diplomatic history. In December 1918, just weeks after the war ended, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau visited London. He met with Lloyd George at the French embassy. It was a private, intimate conversation. No secretaries were present, no minutes were taken. Lloyd George turned to Clemenceau and asked him what he wanted. Clemenceau said he wanted Syria. The British Army was currently occupying Syria, but the French regarded it as their historic sphere of influence. Lloyd George made a counteroffer. He said Britain would give Syria to France. Britain would betray the Arab armies of Prince Fisazel, who had fought alongside Lawrence of Arabia to liberate Damascus. They would hand Damascus and the Arabs over to French colonial rule. In exchange, Britain wanted Mosul. Clemenceau agreed. With a handshake over a cup of tea, the fate of millions of people was decided. Syria went to France, and the oil of Mosul went to the British Empire. This deal was formalized later at the San Remo Conference in 1920. The British were given the mandate for Mesopotamia. They now legally, in the eyes of the League of Nations, controlled the oil. But now they faced a new problem, a problem of governance. How do you govern this place? The territories they had conquered were not a nation. They were three separate Ottoman provinces that had very little in common. Basra was Shiite and focused on trade with India and the Gulf. Baghdad was Sunni and Persian and mixed, a cosmopolitan hub. Mosul was Kurdish and Turkoman and looked north toward Anatolia. There was no sense of an Iraqi national identity. These people did not view themselves as one nation. But the British didn't care about national identity. They cared about pipeline security. They needed a single administrative unit that would cover the oil fields in the north, the refinery in the south, and the transport routes in between. So they decided to glue these three disparate provinces together into a single state. They invented the country of Iraq. The name Iraq is an old Arabic term meaning the fertile land or the river shore, but it had never been the name of a political country. The British drew the borders not based on ethnicity or religion or geography, but based on the needs of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They included the Kurds in the north because the oil was under their feet. They included the Shiites in the south because the ports were there. They forced these groups into a marriage of convenience that would be managed by London. But the people of Iraq did not want to be managed by London. They had been promised independence. During the war, the British had plastered the walls of Baghdad with posters promising freedom from Ottoman tyranny. They had encouraged the Arabs to revolt. Now the Iraqis realized they had simply traded one master for another, a Turkish master for a British master. In the summer of 1920, the country exploded. It started in the mid-Euphrates region. Shiite clerics issued fatwas against the British occupation. Tribal leaders gathered their warriors. In the north, the Kurds rose up. It was a full-scale national revolution known as the Great Iraqi Revolt of 1920. The British were caught completely off guard. They had thought the Arabs would be grateful. Instead, they were facing a jihad. British garrisons were overrun. An entire column of the Manchester Regiment was wiped out at a place called Manchester Hill. Supply trains were derailed. Tax collectors were assassinated. The British Army, exhausted from the World War, found itself fighting a brutal counterinsurgency in the crushing heat. The government in London was horrified. The British public was tired of war. The newspapers asked why British soldiers were dying in a faraway desert now that the war with Germany was over. The cost of the occupation was skyrocketing, putting a massive strain on the treasury. Winston Churchill, now the Secretary of State for War and Air, needed a solution. He needed a way to control Iraq without spending millions of pounds and losing thousands of soldiers. His solution was brutal and revolutionary. He decided to police Iraq from the sky. This was the dawn of air power. The Royal Air Force was looking for a role to prove its worth. Churchill argued that instead of keeping huge armies on the ground, Britain could control the desert tribes using bombers. It was called the Scheme of Air Control. The British built huge air bases at Habbaniyah and Sheba. When a tribe refused to pay taxes or rebelled, the RAF would fly over their villages in biplanes. First, they would drop leaflets warning them to leave. Then, they would drop bombs. They bombed houses, they bombed livestock, and they bombed the people. It was terror bombing used as a tool of colonial administration. And it worked. The cost of the occupation dropped dramatically. The revolt was crushed from the air, the oil was safe. But the British knew they couldn't rule Iraq directly forever. It looked too much like colonialism. They needed a facade of independence. They needed a local face to put on the administration. They needed a king. They looked around for an unemployed royal. They found one in Prince Faisal. Faisal was the son of the Sharif of Mecca, the leader of the Arab revolt. He was a hero of the war who had fought alongside Lawrence. He had been the king of Syria for a few months until the French kicked him out, in accordance with the dirty deal Lloyd George had made. He was currently in exile without a throne. The British invited Faisal to a conference in Cairo in 1921. Winston Churchill presided over the meeting. Lawrence was there as an advisor. They decided over dinner that Faisal would be the king of Iraq. There was only one problem. Faisal had never been to Iraq. He was from the Hijaz in modern-day Saudi Arabia. He didn't know the people, and the people didn't know him. He was a foreigner. It didn't matter. The British put him on a ship, sent him to Basra, and staged a coronation. They rigged a referendum where 96% of the people supposedly voted for him. On August 23, 1921, Faisal was crowned king of Iraq. The British played God Save the King. They designed the flag. They wrote the Constitution. But behind the throne, the British advisors held the real power. And crucially, the oil concession remained firmly in British hands. In 1925, the final piece of the puzzle was put in place. The Iraqi government, under immense British pressure, signed the concession agreement with the Turkish Petroleum Company, now renamed the Iraq Petroleum Company. The deal was a robbery. The company got the exclusive rights to drill for oil in all of Iraq for 75 years. In exchange, the Iraqi government got a fixed royalty of 4 shillings per ton of oil. No share of the profits, no ownership, just a small fee. And who owned the Iraq Petroleum Company? It was a consortium of the victors. The British Anglo-Persian Oil Company held nearly half the shares. Shell held a chunk. The French got a share, their prize for giving up the land of Mosul. And eventually, the Americans pushed their way in to get a share too. Koste Gulbenkian, the man who had helped put it all together, kept his famous 5%, making him one of the richest men in the world. The oil began to flow. Massive pipelines were built across the desert from Kirk to the Mediterranean Sea. The British Navy got its fuel. The shareholders in London and Paris got their dividends. BP became one of the biggest companies in the world. But for Iraq, the legacy was darker. The country had been born in original sin. It was a state created for the convenience of foreign powers. Its borders forced together people who did not want to be together. Its government was viewed as a puppet of the West. The British ruled Iraq informally until the Revolution of 1958, when the monarchy was overthrown in a bloody coup and the king was killed. But the structure they created remained. The focus on oil above all else distorted the Iraqi economy and politics. It made the state a prize to be captured by strongmen. When Saddam Hussein rose to power, he was, in many ways, inheriting the state machinery that the British had built to secure the oil. And when the Americans and British invaded Iraq again in 2003, they were marching over the same ground as General Maude and General Townshend. They were fighting in the same cities. They were dealing with the same divisions between Kurd and Sunni and Shia that the British had papered over in 1920. There is a cemetery in Baghdad called the Northgate War Cemetery. It is a quiet, dusty place. In it lie the graves of thousands of British and Indian soldiers who died in the invasion of 1914. They died believing they were fighting for king and country. They died believing they were protecting India. But if you look at the dates on the gravestones and then look at the corporate records of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, you see the truth. They died for the pipeline. They died for the refinery at Avden. They died so that the British Empire could switch from coal to oil. The invasion of 1914 was the first oil war in history. It was a heist of continental proportions. It turned the Middle East into the petrol station of the world and condemned its people to a century of intervention and war. The British Empire is long gone, but the borders they drew remain. The oil wells they drilled are still pumping, and the ghost of that first invasion still haunts the deserts of Iraq, waiting for the next empire to come looking for the black gold. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.